they would be preserving every piece of evidence, and yet they were doing quite the opposite. They were destroying evidence even then. They were trying to get Schapelle to touch the bag, which at that stage, if they really thought that they'd caught a drug smuggler, they would have kept that bag as far away from her as possible, because they would have been able to say, your fingerprints are on there and you didn't touch it at the airport, so you're absolutely guilty beyond any doubt. But they were doing the opposite. They were trying to get her to touch it.
I'm curious to know...
And then, of course, all the other things that they denied.
I'm curious to know why the Indonesian media was there at the airport.
Well, it was international media were there at the airport straight away.
Straight away?
Yeah, well, within 15 minutes, there was...
That's extraordinary in itself.
Well, because they had us... They wanted a big drug bust, and to get... possibly to get... This is only conjecture, that they wanted to get funding for war on drugs. It could have been for a lot of reasons. To Pastrika, to try and get... climb the ladder again. He wasn't very popular. Bali was starving at the time because of the Bali bombings. There was a myriad of reasons why it could have happened, why they did it.
Oh, look, I can tell you right now, let's make it very clear. The Indonesians were very angry with Australia over many things. And I'll just tell you two things in particular. East Timor made every Indonesian hate Australia because of the way the Australians intervened over East Timor. But that was just the beginning. The Bali bombing was a total slap in the face to the Indonesians, because the Australian Federal Police just rocked in and they just took over the crime scene, and they drove the show. They decided who was going to be prosecuted, and the Indonesians basically just had to come along for the ride. And by the time Schapelle was arrested, they were pushing for Abu Bakar Bashir to basically get the death penalty. This is what Australia was doing to Indonesia, and this was all part of the war on terror, part of the war in Iraq, and all following from September 11. This is all interconnected.
That also comes down to what Sean was saying with funding, this whole sort of terror funding from multinational, from other countries, to sort of showcase the police work on how good they are and how good they are anti-terror and all this stuff, and that they need more funding, and look at the war on drugs here as well. I mean, they're really, I mean, it is conjecture, but it is always important to look at reasons why and what could be, reasons for these sort of actions.
Well, I see the situation as potentially that Schapelle is like a hostage. Schapelle is a hostage to the Indonesians. I mean, Australia has put a variety of pressure on Indonesia against what they wanted, and I tend to see it, if it was done at that end, if the drugs were planted in her bag at that end, what I see going on is that the Indonesians basically wanted to reset the balance, to basically reassert their control and their power. And we had to go along with it. See, our government had to go along with it because we were already pretty up to our arms in lies and corruption. That the whole situation between Australia and Indonesia has a lot of problems with it. A lot of deception, a lot of corruption has gone down the tubes. So for them to hang on to her, I think from a face-saving point of view, I can understand it almost as like a colossal mistake, but not really a mistake. But I also see the Bali Nine, who were arrested only shortly after Schapelle, as being somehow pawns in this game too. And I did get the impression that when the Bali Nine were originally captured, and great efforts were made to make sure they were captured in Indonesia rather than letting them return to Australia, it looked as if a trade-off was going to happen, and the Indonesians were going to say, well, you can have Schapelle back, we'll keep the Bali Nine. I thought that's what was going to happen. I thought, they've worked a trade-off, right? It's a face-saving solution, because the Bali Nine were guilty. They've admitted it. Okay, so
but strapped to their bodies is a bit hard.
So they're not protesting their innocence. So potentially that was organised by the AFP. I'm just purely hypothetical here, but possibly the AFP were going to say, well, you can have the Bali Nine.
Well,
give us Schapelle back. I don't know.
But, I really don't agree. I mean, I'm not saying it's not true, but the only thing is that this is conjecture. Well, the other stuff is real, like it's true.
Indeed.
The things that have been done, well, like we're surmising some of this, but when you look at the facts of what's happened, like the Australian government were well aware. They had to have been well aware. Now, if the Australian government really believed for one moment that marijuana was being sent from Australia to Indonesia, they would have had to have gone to Schapelle's home and searched it, and searched a card, at least to show the Indonesians that we're not taking it lightly, that we don't allow our citizens to take drugs to your country.
Indeed.
And they didn't do any of that. And when even McKelty, when he was asked why there was no investigation in Australia, and even after Schapelle's pleading for the investigation, he stated that we are not in the business of clearing people. Meaning, if you turn that around and you say, well, if you're not in the business of clearing people, then you're saying that if you do an investigation, you will clear her. You know, it's as simple as that. But Howard was a lawyer, like John Howard's a lawyer. He knew what was going on, and yet time and time again they kept on saying that they had no influence with the Indonesian courts, and yet there was a policy which was signed in 1987, which is a treaty between Australia and New Zealand, exactly allowing them that they must get a sample of evidence if they ask in murder or drug cases, that if they apply for it, then it must be given. And the Australian government kept on telling the Australian people that they couldn't interfere. Well, they weren't interfering. They had every right to. The AFP could have asked for a sample, and they had every right to ask for that sample of marijuana. And then the big media circus began. You know, Australia were as everyone knows, there was 90% belief in Schapelle at that stage.
There was. Television polls were giving 90%. Absolutely.
And I think actually even some of those polls that were coming out late were double negatives, I think, to even try and get those poll numbers down, because they were asking, you had to answer no to a positive question. Like they were asking, I forget the exact question, like, do you believe that Schapelle is guilty? And you have to say no. But if you would have said, do you believe that Schapelle is innocent, people would say yes more readily. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Because you've got to give a negative answer to that. If you give a positive answer to a positive question, you'll get more of a positive response.
Now, this all started to change, didn't it, around about at the point when she was convicted, or just before?
Oh, just before. Well,
right.
They started to go in damage control. Matthew Moore wrote the piece, just the pack of lies in the paper, in the Sydney Morning Herald, about how Indonesians, how Western Australians were taking marijuana to Indonesia.
I've got that article up here on my screen. The title is...
And calling it Aussie Gold. It had a name of Aussie Gold. Well, if it's so... And he writes in this, which is laughable, but it's dangerous to buy marijuana in Indonesia. So, you know, Australians don't do it. So then he goes on to say that they're selling marijuana over there to Australians. Well, wouldn't it be more dangerous to sell marijuana than to buy marijuana? You know, the death penalty for selling it, for buying it, you're just going to get, you know, a slap on the wrist or whatever, you know, sort of thing. But it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as trying to sell the product.
Look, there are a huge number of problems with that story, and I encourage our listeners to check it out, and also check out the rebuttal article that was written. The article was called Why Australian Marijuana is a Big Hit in Bali, and it makes statements like this. While drugs might seem freely available on the streets, the foreigners who live in Bali, including those serving time in Corobokan jail, say that buying them is a risky business because you never know if the seller is an undercover police officer or a police informer. For that reason, Westerners in Bali are prepared to pay premium prices for marijuana if they can get it from other Westerners. Okay, now that's a good story. It sounds clever, and a lot of people will buy that, but it's completely ridiculous. It's a completely absurd statement. If it had some facts behind it, I might be inclined to believe it, but it's purely speculative. I mean, there's no...
This guy just comes out and says this without any sort of reference. I mean, it's just...
Well, he says here, a European man now serving a jail term for possessing hashish, says he knows of several Australians who've been bringing strong hydroponic marijuana into Bali. Now, wouldn't you think a statement like that